Hello again, everybody. So for today's video, what we're going to be looking at is, well, for this particular video, we're going to look at the peace that ends the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, which is, in many ways, probably one of the best examples of how not to do a peace treaty in world history. It's a treaty that in many ways makes World War II a virtual certainty, and is definitely one of the direct causes of both that conflict and the rise to power of Adolf Hitler. So I think it's an important document, one that's definitely worth exploring. It's also a document that, in many ways, creates circumstances that would lead to later conflicts. As I mentioned previously, World War I is essentially the grandfather of all modern conflict. And that's not just limited to World War II. It also extends to things like modern day conflicts in the Middle East, the continued conflict in Israel between Israelis and Palestinians, the issues between Shia and Sunni Muslims, and the Kurds in Iraq and Iran, and modern Turkey, and really just a whole litany of conflicts that can trace their origin in some way to decisions made in 1919 and the years immediately following that, the kind of follow-on treaties that followed the Treaty of Versailles. So let's begin by deep diving into the last week of World War I, really. By early November of 1918, the United States, France, Great Britain, and the British Commonwealth countries, Canada and Australia, were all simultaneously engaged in massive offensives against Germany. And by this point in the war, things had gone from bad to worse for them. At this point, 4 years of British blockade and limited access to food and various other supplies had finally begun taking their toll. There were riots in streets in Berlin and other German cities because of critical food shortages, and much as had happened in Russia, there was a revolution that overthrew the Tsar, or the Kaiser, sorry, who was forced to flee to neutral Holland. So after the Kaiser flees Germany, the new German leaders have to decide how they're going to try to bring this conflict to an end. They don't want the war to come into German territory itself and bring the devastation that they had wrought on their neighbor, France, for 4 years into their own country. And given the massive military advantage that the Allies at this point enjoy, which with the arrival of around 1,000 American troops in France every day, would only grow as time went on, and as the size of the massive American army that finally was being deployed in large numbers began to bear an ever greater influence on the outcome of the conflict, Germany's leaders ultimately decide to seek a negotiated armistice. Now, the principal reason why Germany's leaders seek a negotiated armistice in the first week of November 1918 is because of a speech that President Woodrow Wilson had made nearly a year earlier, in January of 1918, 10 months earlier. This speech is commonly referred to as the 14-point speech, which, spoiler alert, is because it contained, wait for it, exactly 14 points of things that Wilson considered to be important in building a more harmonious, more cooperative, and fundamentally more democratic world order following the end of the First World War. This speech contained a lot of very idealistic and very humanistic elements, calls for ends to secret treaties, like the ones that had ultimately helped produce the First World War. It called for freedom of navigation of the seas and the abandonment of blockades as a offensive weapon, which of course had strangled Germany and indirectly brought the United States into the war, and as well as various other things, rights for self-determination for various peoples. This was primarily aimed at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany's ally, who themselves exited the conflict on November the 3rd after their defeat by the Italians um, at Vittorio Veneto, at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Um, but by far the biggest thing that sealed the deal for the German leaders was Wilson's insistence that rather than having um, draconian measures, the sort of victor's justice at the end of the war, that instead there would emerge this new international order built around a concept of international cooperation and mediation rather than the use of military force or other coercive measures through a international delegation that Wilson dreamed up called the League of Nations. And so this very idealistic and very humanitarian idea for establishing world peace was naturally very appealing to Germany's leaders now that the war had turned quite decisively against them. And it was the major reason why Germany's new leaders ultimately decided to agree to the November 11th armistice. They felt, with Woodrow Wilson at the table, based on the reception of his speech in Europe and in the United States, that surely Germany would be given fair treatment in any peace negotiations that followed. And that would end up not being the case. Ultimately, after Germany agreed to the November 11th armistice, President Wilson himself did become heavily involved in the negotiations of what would eventually come to be known as the Treaty of Versailles. And doing so broke major precedents, both formal and informal, in the role presidents play in shaping and ultimately drafting American foreign policy. No American president before Wilson had ever left the country while still in office. But Wilson ultimately decides to do so in early 1919 to head up the American delegation at the Paris Peace Conference to draw up what the Treaty of Versailles. He decides to do this himself, and when he arrives in Europe, he's greeted with rapturous applause. Everywhere he goes, crowds eagerly assemble to see him. He's cheered in the streets of London and Paris. And based on this wild reception that Wilson receives from the populations of Europe, he thinks surely his vision of a magnanimous, kind of let's let bygones be bygones kind of vision for peace would hold similar appeal with Europe's political leaders. He was mistaken in this for a number of reasons, not the least of which was, arguably a certain degree of tone deafness on Wilson's part. Many of Europe's leaders were like, look, it's easy for you to say, let's let bygones be bygones and put this all behind us. Your country lost 112,000 people, was only in the war in a meaningful sense for 6 months. By comparison, countries like Britain and France and Italy all lost massive numbers of people. Collectively, those three countries alone lost over 3 million men in the fighting in the trenches of the First World War, which makes the American casualties in the war, although at the time the highest death count in any American war other than the American Civil War, and certainly very high when you consider the relatively short period of time in which those casualties were accrued. It pales in comparison to what countries like Britain and France had suffered during the war. And so I think partly because of that, they were not in the same sort of conciliatory mood that Wilson was. Another factor that played into this is just basic hard European power politics. These countries wanted to gain territorial concessions out of Germany. They wanted to expand their empires or expand their own home territory in the case of Italy, and also France, truthfully. And so they really have this idea that they're going to do all this sort of stuff in this manner. And moreover, particularly for the French, who is worth remembering had been invaded by German armies twice in less than 50 years, first in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, and then once again in 1914 when German forces invaded through neutral Belgium. So a combination of a desire to exact vengeance because of the losses that their countries had suffered during the First World War, a desire to exact territorial concessions out of Germany that would benefit their own overseas empires, and finally, a desire to weaken Germany to such a degree that it would no longer pose a threat to them, were all major factors in why European leaders largely rejected Wilson's humanitarian and idealistic ideas for a peace treaty. And ultimately, as a result of this, the Treaty of Versailles is incredibly vindictive towards Germany. So vindictive, in fact, that it creates conditions within Germany that unwittingly would facilitate the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. We'll get into that in a second. But basically, as I mentioned, the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy, they really want to humiliate Germany. And so, to that end, the Treaty of Versailles contains several important clauses. The first clause is that it requires Germany to accept complete blame for the First World War, which certainly Germany deserved a sizable, if not a majority share of the blame for starting the First World War. Arguably, if if Kaiser Wilhelm hadn't, been, kind of giving the attaboys to the Emperor of Austria-Hungary as he aggressively and foolishly pursued war in Serbia, knowing that it would bring Russia into the conflict. Certainly, Germany bears a large percentage of the responsibility for causing World War One. But to say that they caused it in its entirety is a bit of a stretch. But nonetheless, the Treaty of Versailles required them to assume complete responsibility for causing the First World War. And as conditions for that principal claim, that principal clause, Germany was forced to essentially prostrate itself before the victorious Allies in a number of ways that it found that were not only deeply humiliating for Germany psychologically and in terms of its world standing, but also proved to be economically devastating for the country. The first thing it was required to do, as a condition of accepting guilt for causing the First World War, was Germany was required to dramatically downsize its sizable military establishment. This involved, amongst other things, giving away its overseas colonies in Africa and Asia, colonies which came under largely the control of Britain and France, because their colonies generally were adjacent to the German colonies, particularly in Africa. So that was something that would ultimately cause considerable frustration in the United States. Many would come to see the terms of the Treaty of Versailles as evidence that the U.S. had been duped into fighting Europe's wars for it for the benefit of European colonial empires. And certainly the way in which Germany's colonies were dealt with, as well as the colonies or the portions, I should say, of the dismembered Ottoman Empire in the Middle East, definitely lend some legitimacy to those accusations. So Germany's forced to surrender its overseas territories to the Allies, which largely benefits Britain and France. Then it is required to dramatically reduce the size of its military. It's basically limited to having a peacetime, basically glorified national police force of 100,000 men. It's forbidden entirely from having an air force. And it's also forbidden from having a large navy. And in particular, it's forbidden from having a submarine fleet. So Germany is left without its colonies. It's left militarily weak. Parts of Germany itself end up under Allied occupation, like the Ruhr River Valley and the Rhineland, which come under French military control. And so This is a treaty that will prove to be for many a very bitter pill to swallow, and one that they will see as a massive national humiliation of their country's very proud military tradition. The other component of this, beyond the fact that Germany is required to give up its colonies and to dramatically reduce its military, the big whopper, the thing that makes the Treaty of Versailles so particularly harmful to Germany, and which ultimately plays the biggest role in facilitating the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in Germany, is that as part of Germany's acceptance of guilt for causing the First World War, they're forced to pay this massive $33 billion reparation to the Allies. Now, what that ends up doing is it plunges the, you know, the basically the newborn German democratic government, which is known as the Weimar Republic. It plunges them into complete political and economic chaos. Hyperinflation takes a grip in Germany. The value of the Reichsmark plummets to the point that by the early 1920s, people are actually using printed paper money as toilet paper because it's actually cheaper than going out and buying the stuff. Um, and so you get this hyperinflation, which of course devastates the economy, creates massive shortages, and as a result of this, coupled with the lingering resentment that the loss of Germany's military prowess and its overseas territories produces, creates a lot of bitterness and resentment and a lot of anger within Germany. And ultimately, that anger and frustration leads to a search for people to blame, people to affix blame for Germany's woes upon. And into that political void that the new democratically elected German government, the Weimar Republic, cannot ultimately fill with its liberal democracy, you see the emergence on the left of the communists and on the right of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And of course, eventually, by the early 1930s, after in many cases brutal street battles between those two groups, the Nazis eventually managed to build a winning political coalition, and by 1933 managed to seize the reins of power in Germany. Of course, once they do that, they then, implement a campaign of ethnic cleansing. They blame the Jews for Germany's woes, and eventually, looking outward beyond Germany's borders, will begin seeking vengeance on those that had humiliated Germany in the First World War, which of course will eventually bring about World War II. So that's all a very long and roundabout way of saying that the Treaty of Versailles creates conditions in Germany that essentially make World War II inevitable. The one saving grace of the treaty, as far as Woodrow Wilson and people back home are concerned, is the fact that they do agree to Wilson's demand to create a League of Nations as part of the framework for the post-war world. And Wilson genuinely thought that if he was able to wring this principal concession out of the leaders of Britain, France, and Italy to agree to create a League of Nations to arbitrate disputes through non-military means, he felt that if he was able to at least get that he could then, through American leadership in the League of Nations, mitigate some of the negative and more punitive aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. Ultimately, of course, that was not to be. And a big part of it has to do with Wilson's own obstinacy and obtuseness as a politician. Wilson, when he went to Paris in early 1919, had just lost control of both houses of Congress to a slight Republican majority. But rather than including Republicans in his, kitty again. Rather than including Republicans in the American treaty delegation, he went on his own and did things on his own pretty much without anybody's input. When he came back with the treaty in hand, Republicans read it and basically said, "Whoa, we've got some issues with this." The leader of this opposition was Massachusetts Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and Lodge's issue with this was that he felt that this treaty, by committing the U.S. to the League of Nations and this sort of internationalist framework, traded away too much American sovereignty and the ability of the United States to act independently in its own interests. And so he insisted on putting in what he called reservations into the treaty, that would grant the United States some leeway in terms of international action. These were relatively mild accommodations, and many of Wilson's advisors and many of his fellow Democrats urged him to accept them. But Wilson ultimately decided, look, he drew his line in the sand and he basically said, no, this thing's going to go through the way I want it to be, the way it was drawn up, or it's not happening at all. And so by taking that kind of all or nothing attitude towards it, it essentially brings things to a head. And when the final vote is held in the Senate, they come up short of the votes necessary to ratify the treaty, and along with it, American membership in the League of Nations. And so, in one of the great and perverse ironies of history, Woodrow Wilson, the brainchild of the League of Nations, ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1920 for thinking up the League of Nations, which is assembled that year in Geneva, Switzerland. But his own country, the United States, because of his own political, arguably his own political grandstanding, is not a member of that organization, which weakens it critically from the outset. And this really marks the beginning of a period of isolationism and general American retreat from commitments and interactions with the wider world, that will end up having rather severe consequences. Now, this is not to say that World War II wouldn't have happened had the United States played a major role in the League of Nations. It likely probably still would have. But the fact that the United States was absent from the organization, and the fact that leadership in the organization was ultimately fell into the laps of the leaders of Britain and France, two countries that have been badly mauled in the trenches of World War I, and were to a certain degree understandably gun shy about taking any kind of aggressive actions. It would lead to a situation where you would have this international organization that was basically powerless to prevent another world war from happening within less than 20 years. So essentially, the Treaty of Versailles is, again, important for two reasons in this context. The first is that it basically creates conditions that facilitate the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis and make World War II virtually inevitable. And secondly, that the American rejection of membership in the League of Nations ultimately brings about a period of profound isolationism in the United States that wouldn't be broken until the Japanese attack on the American naval installation at Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941.